And we'll turn to Maria Prados now. Maria is an economist at the USC Center for Economic and Social Research. She specializes in quantitative and applied economics, and her research interests have to do with health, gender, labor economics, and household decisions. So it looks like she just posted her slides. So the floor is yours, Maria.
Okay, thanks. Let me know if you can't hear me.
You're good. We can hear you
So,
and see.
good. I'll arrange this one more time. All right. So thanks for being here and including this paper in the program. So we are looking at the effect that the pandemic had in parents. So we know that it has had a big impact on almost everyone. And as we've seen in several papers, it has affected people differentially depending on their circumstances and their characteristics. So in this paper, we focus on how it has affected households functioning and especially labor market outcomes for those who had children. The reason for this is that early on in the pandemic, we had all this big effect on employment. And on top of that, there were school closures and childcare center closures across the country that affected everyone with children in the household and created an abrupt increase in childcare needs. So from previous work, we know that during the first few months of the pandemic, there was an association between increased childcare needs and childcare responsibilities and employment outcomes, and also reduction in working hours for those who remained employed. So evidently, there is an association between time demands at home and what parents were able to do in the workforce. So in the fall of 2020, schools started to reopen. And this was not a result of any kind of centralized decision, but on the contrary, these were discretionary measures taken by school districts across the country. So the result was that different places were exposed to different instruction modes for schools. So some schools were fully in person, some schools were offering only remote learning, and some schools had a hybrid version of those. So we want to know how this crisis affected household labor supply and how these families are adjusting now that the economy is recovering. And also if there have been differential effects, for instance, by gender or by whether the parent was the one taking care of the kids early on in the pandemic. So to do this measurement, we used data from the UAS COVID tracking survey that we merged at the census tract level with school districts information about school reopenings from the MCH strategic data. And we also merged this data with COVID incidence rates at the local level from the New York Times case count. And we exploit this geographic variation in school instruction modality using a triple difference approach to be able to estimate the effects of public school reopenings for in-person learning on labor market outcomes that we have. So we are looking at the dynamics of employment. We are looking at the recovery from employment loss. So for this, we're going to focus on the subsample of people who were working in March of 2020, but were out of employment because either they quit or they lost their jobs in April of 2020. So there's a big share of population that went through that transition. So we want to see if school reopenings had a differential impact on them. And lastly, we look at the effect of the reduction of work hours for those who remained employed. So we are going to be looking at 3 different subsamples for these 3 different outcomes. And so our sample is going to be respondents between 18 and 65 years old in the UAS that are either married or living together with another adult with their partners in the same household, because we think that, well, this is the kind of group that would have a chance for some insurance across households. And we are looking at those who were employed in March of 2020, we're using all the way up until January of 2021. So to give you a sense of the numbers during this time, this is the percentage of adults employed in their subsample from March 2020 until January 2021. So we see here at the beginning the big drop that I mentioned. And what we have here is the green line are male workers, and the orange line at the bottom are female workers. So we see that at the beginning, married women lost their jobs at a higher rate than men. The recovery also was slower for women, although the trends were kind of parallel. So the gap, the big gap that increased at the beginning, it kind of remained through the first 9 or 10 waves of the COVID tracking survey. The dotted red line indicates the point in time at about the average point in time at which the fall semester began. So this is when some schools started to reopen for in-person instruction. So we see that here there's a little bit more of a recovery for women than for men. So this is what we're trying to measure. One of the things that we're trying to measure here. And second, here I show again the percentage of people employed, but this time we divide them by whether or not they have kids in the household. And these are school age kids, right, in K-12, grades K to 12. The orange line are respondents with kids, and the green line are respondents with no kids. And so we see that the evolution for these two groups for the first 4 waves of the pandemic was more or less similar. And then there's an improvement in employment for parents, but not too much. So that after the summer, we see that there's some more improvements for parents than non-parents. So again, this is the kind of effects that we are trying to measure in our approach to see if these differences are an effect of school reopening. So what we have in mind is a treatment according to this timeline. So we see here that the first few waves of the COVID tracking survey, schools were closed between April and July. Then we have the summer months, and then we have late August and September. There's the period where schools start to reopen. So some schools open for in-person instruction and some don't. And then we have the remaining waves of the fall semester. So our treatment is going to be those waves after schools reopen for in-person instruction. And we're going to see if that has a differential impact on parents of those kids. So we're trying to see, to interpret this as a kind of an exogenous change in their availability of school, and therefore in the needs for time devoted to childcare for parents. So for this, we use a triple differences approach with individual fixed effects for the subsample of respondents who were employed in March of 2020. So in this triple difference approach, we're going to estimate the model for 3 outcomes. The outcomes are employment, recovery from unemployment for those who lost their jobs or who quit their jobs in April of 2020, and whether or not individuals reduced their working hours for those who remained employed. So we have individual time effects, we have individual fixed effects, we have time effects. And so in the triple difference, we compare individuals before and after the summer with parents, with people who were in the same type of district, so people who were in districts that offered in-person instruction versus those who offered remote instruction. And we also use the group of non-parents as kind of a control for other circumstances that may have been correlated with the decisions to offer in-person instruction versus offering remote instruction. So this triple difference, we think, allows us to get to that effect, that differential effect of in-person instruction on parental labor outcomes. So this is how it looked like at the beginning of the fall semester, or during the fall semester of 2020, in terms of what students had access to in-person instruction versus remote instruction. So darker blue means more intensity of remote instruction, and lighter green are in-person instruction. So you see there's a lot of geographic variation in terms of access to schools. And so one concern about this could be that, well, the decisions to open schools for in-person instruction may be correlated to the circumstances, and in particular COVID incidents. There are papers looking at that, and their conclusion is that COVID incidence rates at the local level did not seem to be much associated with this decision to open in person versus remote. Moreover, it seems like the decisions about school modality are strongly associated with political leanings instead of COVID incidence rates. And in any case, in our analysis, we still control for COVID incidence rates just to account for that in the case that there may be some influence. And another reassuring finding is that most schools remained in the same instruction modality as their district at the beginning of the semester. So the fact that we are studying those months between September and December of 2020 should not be a problem for this. And that's so. In terms of why we look at gender, for instance, in this analysis, what you see here is the gender gap in childcare responsibilities in the home. So the blue line at the left is the share of women who were the main responsible for childcare. This was 33% of working women in the spring of 2020, whereas only 11% of fathers were the main responsible for childcare. And this
Hi, Maria. Sorry to interrupt,
but
but you have about a minute left.
Okay, so I'll jump to the results, I think. I told you I was going to lose the track of that. So our estimated coefficient for the triple difference, we didn't find an effect on the main specification. So then we include interactions with female, and we find that school reopenings made it more likely that mothers were employed, but at the same time made it less likely that mothers recover from unemployment, meaning that unemployment seems to be more persistent for mothers and fathers, and school reopenings didn't help with that. We don't find any significant effects depending on childcare responsibilities early on in the pandemic, but we do find when we interact with being able to work from home before the pandemic began, that people who were not able to work from home seem to have been most helped by school reopenings in terms of remaining employed and also recovery from employment. And with that, I wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Any just to the group, anybody have any questions of clarification?
So if I may, Maria, so that result for unemployment, that you don't see recovery from unemployment, I guess that's what you would expect, right? Because unemployment by definition is people who want to work, right? And here what you're changing is it was going to affect on labor supply, right? Not on labor demand. So
this is right. So that's a good point, because I probably didn't mention this. So this is not unemployment necessarily, but it's not employed. So that's a good catch. Yeah. So what we include there is everyone who was not employed, who was employed in March and was not employed in April, without thinking about whether or not they want to be employed, because that's what we're trying to capture, right? Like the outcome is going to be a combination of whether or not they can get a job versus whether or not they are able to go and get a job. So in a way, the fact that some fathers are still helped by that means that our hypothesis is that there's a persistent effect of the decision maybe to leave the workforce for mothers early on in the pandemic. And so if that's the case, then school reopenings would not be of help for those who decided to leave early on.
Okay.